Welcome to Teachers Talk Money, where a millennial high school teacher and a Gen X elementary teacher get together to talk all things money.
From salary scales to saving, investing, and self-care, we're here to help teachers master their money. I'm Christy.
And I'm Rachel, and we're so glad you're here. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Teachers Talk Money podcast. We are so excited you're here again with us this week. It means the world to us, and we're so happy that we're able to add value to your life in each of these episodes. Hey Christy.
Hey Rachel, how's it going?
Good. My update this week is just that I received some stipends this month, or some parts of my stipends this month. And I'm really excited about that because I just sent most of it straight to my Roth IRA. And then the rest of it went to my grad school sinking fund to keep funding classes that I'm using to advance my position on the salary scale. And I actually just applied for some of those credits this morning. So it just feels really good to be seeing this money that I earned and then just reinvesting all of it back into myself and my future and the potential of making more money in that future also. How are you?
That's awesome. Congratulations. I am doing great. I had a really good week. Our district finally brought on Aspire Financial Services as a 457 and 403B provider. And they're awesome because it allows people to either bring their own financial advisor to the service or self-direct their investments and then self-direct our accounts. So if you have Aspire as an option in your district, take note because it's a really great option. And now the next step is continuing to work on building education within our district so that teachers know that it's an option. But that was really great news because up until now, we've only had a very, very, very limited selection of people to work with, and there has not been a self-directed option. So I was excited about that.
And were you part of the committee that brought that on? Because I know you're involved in some of those decisions.
Yes, I am part of that committee. And while I didn't get to make the final decision, I definitely advocated strongly for a self-directed option because that can be such a great way for teachers to save on fees. And it was a long road, and we're still on the road in terms of how to get the word out and really educate people. But I think it's gonna be a good improvement for us. We're excited.
Wow, you are so awesome. That is amazing that you were able to do that. And I think so many people in your district are going to be affected by that. That's amazing.
Well, I hope so. If we can, again, get the word out. It's still just like, it's so hard because my district doesn't view me as an expert. And while I am not an expert, I'm not a financial advisor. That equals in their mind that I can't say anything about personal finance to teachers and about like some ideas of how to get started with how to even ask questions to find out what you're investing in or who you're investing with and whether or not they're in your best interest. And so that's been really frustrating because they were only letting the quote unquote experts speak, but those experts are also not going to lead with what fees they're charging. And so that's been really frustrating, but I'm sticking with it and we're going to just keep making progress as best we can.
Good for you.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, I'm excited for your entire district for that. And for you to keep chugging along, trying to make inches of progress.
What do they say? Turning around an aircraft carrier? That's what it's like. But we're making the turn.
I'm so excited about that. So in this episode, this is part 1 of our Summer Money series. And this is the series where we're taking a much deeper dive into the bigger topics of personal finance, just when we have supposedly a little bit more time and space than during the school year to really digest this information. So today's episode is all about debt payoff. We're going to go over the mindsets that are so crucial to being able to pay off your debt, as well as all of the different methods that are out there for strategizing your debt payoff plan.
Awesome. Let's get started.
Yeah. So let's start by talking about the mindset. The first thing is that, much like a lot of topics in personal finance, debt is something we like to avoid and pretend it doesn't exist and not know exactly what the numbers are, because if we don't know what they are, then they can't scare us, which is of course not true, because we're living in fear of looking at these numbers and because they're affecting us whether or not we're looking at them. So while it's so terrifying. You have to know your situations, the facts and reality of your situation right now in order to be able to make a plan to face it.
Yeah, it's so important. It's like you can't solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is. And I like to think about it as like your debt is there either way. It's either lurking in the shadows, giving you anxiety as like this thing in the back of your mind that you don't want to pay attention to, or it's out in the open where you can tame it. And when I started thinking about this episode, I just kind of, this vision of a dragon came into my head of like, that's what the debt is. It's the debt dragon. And you cannot slay that dragon if you don't have control over it and if you don't know where it is and how big it is. And so I think it's so critical to check all of those balances, write them down on a piece of paper, name that problem and describe it so that you can know where you're going to need to start. And it's amazing. So many people don't really know the number of how much student loan debt they have or how much credit card debt they have if they added it all up or how much is left on their car loan. And while those can come with varying degrees of anxiety, once you put them all in the same place, you can start to ferret out where you need to begin to slay that dragon. So don't be afraid to do that. Such an important first step.
So another piece of the mindset that's really important for this is focusing on one piece of your debt at a time. If you have 12 credit cards, a bunch of student loans, a car loan, and a mortgage, it can feel all the more overwhelming. But if you're focusing on one thing that you're directing all of your available money to while you're also making minimum payments on the others, then you're going to make so much more progress and so much more momentum. There are so many scary things that come along with debt. Creditors making phone calls to you, paying overdraft fees, interest charges, paying late fees. And honestly, even just reading that list, my heart rate has increased, my blood pressure has gone up.
It's a lot.
Yeah, and I've seen this happen. Like I've seen this happen to people in my family and friend group, and it's so deeply upsetting and so overwhelming. But if you start with something that's manageable, then that's what's going to help you really in the long term eliminate this debt.
I'm as you're talking, I'm again just thinking about teaching and thinking about, gosh, if I had a first grader on the first day of school and I thunked down, book 7 of the Harry Potter series and said, read this, that first grader is going to be terrified. They're going to be like, but I can't.
I don't know the plot.
But just the sheer magnitude, is just overwhelming. And so it's like, that's how we teach, right? We have to take it one step at a time. Like, what is your next target? And that's how it can be so helpful to see our debt, is just picking that one starting point once you know the playing field and finding that piece that you can hang on to start. And then that's going to lead you to the next step and the next step. So thinking about it in like a sequence of events instead of one giant thing you have to tackle at once is going to be hopefully really, really helpful. And then there are the idea of our habits, right? Like your debt didn't just show up one day in the mailbox. It was built over time. And a lot of times it was out of necessity and it was out of something that you had no choice but to go into debt because of life circumstances. And hopefully those circumstances are working towards a different situation for you. And other times it can be because of just our habits. We're young, we don't realize what we're getting into, we don't maybe understand the full impact of credit card debt, let's say. And so we just get into the habit of like, ooh, I want to go on this vacation, or ooh, I want to buy that or buy this. And so you might have some habits that you need to review and check. And there are the coolest books written now on habits. One is called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and it's worthy of an entire episode. But for now, just notice that you might have some habits to consider if you're going to stop accumulating debt and start building that awareness. Change the spending habits that aren't serving your goals. And to get back to what those goals are, you have your budget, and you have your budget for guidance in terms of how you're moving forward towards those goals.
And going off of all of that and talking about sort of like the necessity of getting into debt at times or the choice to get into debt, we wanted to talk about the mindset of really just forgiving yourself for the debt that you have, because debt is super normalized in our culture for a wide variety of reasons. So we want to go through some of the different types of debt right now and just talk about what the causes of those might be so that you're not putting the shame and blame on yourself when it comes to digging yourself out of that debt.
Yeah. I mean, I think about all the marketing and how much money is put into getting us to buy things and how much brain power and strategy is put into getting us to buy things. And there's a term called lifestyle inflation, which means that as soon as you have A, you want B. And as soon as you have B, you want C, right? Like as soon as you have a nice car, you want a nicer house. And as soon as you have a nicer house, you need a nicer vacation. And, it's just it's like a never ending road of opulence that we are so driven to go down by our consumer culture. And so we're told we're not good enough if we don't have all of those things. And it can be really hard to redirect your life against that lifestyle inflation. And believe me, I mean, David and I have been there. We have made some very conscious decisions, and our friends and family were like, really? That's what you're going to do? Like buying a small house. And it's hard to redirect your life against that tide. So acknowledging what you've come through, if you've bought into that lifestyle inflation, literally, and it's ended up with some debt that you want to get rid of, that's awesome. And own that and be empowered in that. And you're not alone. And then focus on moving forward out of that and starting to notice that consumption that drives our economy and how it's influencing you, and how by turning that tide, you can take more control of your debt and where you're going financially.
Yeah, it's almost something that feels compulsory at times, and you really need to be intentional to make sure either that you're avoiding lifestyle inflation, but honestly, I kind of believe in a little bit of intentional lifestyle inflation as your income increases.
The key word there is intentional. Right? Like if you're doing it on purpose and you're doing it, amen. I do the same thing. But you have to just it's taken me a long time to become aware of it and notice it and pick it when I want it and not just do it because society's telling me I should.
And then we wanted to talk about student loan debt because this is something a ton of teachers have. I know a teacher right now who's on her debt-free journey, and she at the beginning of her career had over $150K in student loan debt for getting a teaching degree. And it's like, your salary is never even going to be that high. Like there's just so much. Student debt is basically presented as compulsory in our society. I mean, it's not something I ever questioned. And it's so bizarre because literally I was 17 years old when I started college. And so I signed on to thousands of dollars in debt as somebody who wasn't even a legal adult. It's bizarre.
And they probably would have given you way more money, right? Like you probably didn't even take all that you could.
Oh, no, definitely not. So this is just the scary reality of what it is. You're told you have to go to college. That's the option. I hope that the tide is changing on that a little bit now. I know that we are focusing a little bit more on career readiness and college readiness at the high school level, but you're told that college is necessary, and it's so unaffordable that literally, I mean, it's not even like I was somebody who just went to school and didn't work. I had 3 jobs when I was in college, and I got a ton of financial aid, and I still had to take on thousands of dollars in debt. So it's not something you can just bootstrap your way through in most cases. So you cannot just be ashamed of yourself and hold on to this and think I'm a bad person because I signed on to all of this student loan debt. Because in reality, you did the best that you could with what you knew at the time. And that's that. That's it.
Well, and as teachers, we really do have to go to college in most states still. We have to have a 4-year degree. And then to further ourselves on the pay scale, in most states, we do need to continue our education. And my husband was the same situation. He's an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker, and he had to have a degree and licensure requirements. So depending on your career, and us as teachers, we really do have to get that 4-year degree. So yeah, student debt, it's a thing, and we're going to be getting into it a lot later. But for now, just know that gosh, we're all in it at some point, basically, sooner or later. And then following student debt is medical debt. We all know that our healthcare system is broken, and it is, some districts have really good healthcare for teachers, and you might have incurred debt before you became a teacher, or maybe your district doesn't have as good of medical insurance as they could. And in a lot of cases, stuff like mental health care is not even on the list of things that are covered. And that is a huge epidemic in our society. So I have a teacher friend right now that is really, working hard to do what's best for her family. And it's so infuriating that she's paying for it all out of pocket. And it's literally a GoFundMe situation. So another thing to not let that shame haunt you is medical debt, because obviously you have to do what's right for you and your family and take care of each other. And unfortunately, our system is just not good in that regard. And we end up with a lot of debt that we shouldn't have.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a friend who was talking to me the other day. She said she was speaking to a international friend. I don't know exactly what country he's from, but he was just like, you can get into debt for getting care that you need. And it's like, yeah, you can get into debt over taking an ambulance. Like, that is... It's so disgusting to me. I don't want to get all into like political stuff, but the political affects the personal finance, and it's just so disturbing that literally just for getting the help and care that you need and you have, I believe, a human right to, that suddenly all of your financial goals are off the table because you had an accident or an emergency. So yeah, do not hold on to shame for medical debt, because that is just like in many cases with student loan debt, and even in some ways with consumer debt, a lot of it has to do with the system we belong to. And there's really only so much individual choice in this. And then the next thing we wanted to talk about is owing the IRS because of mistakes with taxes. This is something there is a lot of shame around, because people just think, oh, I'm stupid. I didn't have the right withholdings, and it's just me being stupid and I don't understand taxes, and that's the problem. And it's just nothing to be ashamed of. Like, I just want you to be able to move forward from that. Like, our tax system also is extremely complicated and confusing. It can be so difficult to get everything right. So just be aware that even if you're owing the government money on your taxes, that is nothing to be ashamed of either. It's just time to make a plan to get that paid off as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. And ultimately, the feelings of shame that we've kind of summarized here are going to encourage you to avoid your debt rather than face it. I think I said before that, like, when I first looked at how much we had, I was literally physically wincing and turning my head away while I was writing because I didn't want to look at it. So as you're paying off debt, remind yourself that having debt, it doesn't make you a bad person or someone who's always going to be bad with money. It's really easy to build up those beliefs around that. And that mindset is something that can then direct your choices. So just grab onto that and make some changes if needed so that you're moving forward in a positive direction.
Yeah, I think there's this idea, especially with debt payoff in the personal finance world, that the shame is motivating, and then that's the thing that's going to get you out of the debt. And that's never been the case for me. The tough love approach is not helpful. It actually makes me have more avoidance behaviors, or if I make a mistake, it completely gives me like an episode where I'm just like, well, I'm just a screw up, and like, this is my fault once again. Rachel always being bad with money, and it's just terrible. Like, you're totally going to derail yourself that way. And then the second part of that is, what's going to happen when you're out of debt? Do you think you're suddenly going to think that you are great with money? No, you're going to hold on to all of those terrible feelings of fear and shame that you don't even need to have and you can let go of. So it's going to be more productive during the journey, and it's going to set you up for a healthier mindset in the long run if you're able to, as you're working on this, obviously it's not going to happen overnight, but as you're working on this, start to let go of those horrible feelings. So keep your growth mindset in mind. I want you to move forward with your actions instead of dwelling on things you've done in the past or the fear and shame that you're feeling that's causing you to avoid your debt. Some of you, up until listening to this episode, might have just been completely avoiding your debt because of these feelings.
I was listening to the Brown Ambition podcast this week, and I forget which one is the budgetnista. She's awesome. But she said that her therapist was talking through feelings of shame with her. And her therapist said, voice is the antidote to shame. And I was like, dang, like, shame thrives in the dark. Shame thrives inside of us where it can haunt us and manipulate us. But as soon as we tell people we trust and tell people that we know are going to support us, that shame loses its power. And it's kind of like by writing down your debt and by looking at it and getting some support if you need to with it, it defies that shame and it makes that shame shut up, because shame can't function when there's empowerment in the same space. And so think about that. Voice is the antidote to shame can really be powerful here.
I just wanted to say that Tiffany, the Budgetnista, is so awesome and everyone should follow her. And she was on an episode of Queer Eye in their Philly season, which is just like one of my favorite shows. And I didn't know she was going to be on it. And I had already been following her and stuff. And she came on to help one of the heroes, they call them, sort of like the contestants on the show that get the makeover, to help him with his finances. And it was so beautiful. Yeah, I love it. So highly recommend The Budgetnista, highly recommend Queer Eye as a show.
Sweet. So speaking of fun stuff, you're going to want to celebrate along the way. For David and I, our debt payoff journey was 10 years plus, depending on if you're including everything. But the student loan piece was 10 years, and we had to celebrate along the way. I mean, it was a long road and it was really hard. We talked earlier about all the side hustles we had, and we weren't making a lot of money. So even working in like a dinner date or, a little something extra on our vacation when we would go backpacking, just to treat ourselves but not derail our plan, was really nice. And so don't feel like it has to be this whole white knuckle experience, that you have to build in some self-care and some celebration of the little wins along the way so that your momentum stays strong and that you stay the course.
Totally. And even sort of going off of that same idea, finding a way to balance paying off your debt with still like living your life and spending money on things that are important to you and working towards your financial goals is so important. While I believe that you should have some level of focus on one small goal at a time, that's sort of more than your other goals, I don't believe in an all or nothing cold turkey spending diet. I think that those, similarly to sort of the shame mindset, can do so much more harm than good, because if you fall off of this extremely strict horse that you've created for yourself, then suddenly you might start falling into that feeling of shame and it could totally derail you again. So balance it out. Make sure you still have your sinking funds. Make sure you still have an emergency fund that you feel comfortable with, or at least you're working towards that as you're paying off your debt. Make sure you still spend on things that are important to you. Don't limit yourself to never eating out or never having something that's enjoyable in your budget every month, because I don't want you to hate your life, A, and B, I don't think you need to. Like, obviously you might have to make some short-term sacrifices, but that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice everything that adds value to your life.
Yeah. And we'll talk more in a later episode as well, but even some investing can happen while you're paying off your debt. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that could be really fun, well, I agree that like cold turkey spending and one and done is not necessarily conducive to success. There are a whole bunch of challenges that go on with like a February no spend challenge or a July no spend challenge. And those can be really fun to help highlight those habits that you might need to take a look at. Is if you challenge yourself to not spend any discretionary money for 2 weeks or a month, you might notice like, oh, I really do want that in my life and I do want to spend money on that. I miss it. Or wow, I'm like totally fine without that daily, whatever it is. And so that can help you fine tune those habits and see where you do really find value in the things you're spending money on and the things that you're like, oh, that I don't really need.
I also, despite the fact that I'm all unfrugal and everything, I love no spend challenges. I think that they're such a great way to have a reset and like add a little bit more intention into your spending.
Yeah, definitely. They can really fight that lifestyle inflation. So another thing that could happen, and I think this is definitely true for me to some degree, and probably Rachel, you too, is that if you're a trailblazer in your family and you're the first one who's intentionally building wealth and ditching your debt, and there's not necessarily someone else in your immediate family that you can identify with, or that's even consciously supporting you, that can be really weird and scary. And it can make it even harder to start to chip away at your debt and change your lifestyle. But the nice thing is that now there is this huge community out there. I mean, if you search #debt-free on Instagram, there's a bajillion people who are sharing all the nuances of how they're getting out of debt and are so excited to engage and talk about it. So your circle may not want you to change, but you still can. And there are so many tools out there now that are just make it even that much easier.
Yeah, and I'm going to add a little plug in here for a friend of ours, an Instagram teacher, money friend of ours, Christy.
Yeah.
Miriam at Millennial Money. She has sort of like a money community that she has recently started. So she's an awesome resource. She's paying off a ton of debt right now too, while still investing in her other goals and herself in other ways. And so consider joining that community.
For sure. So while paying off a huge amount of debt can feel impossible, it can feel like you're that 6-year-old trying to read the whole Harry Potter series all at once. Dare to ask yourself, like, well, what if I did that? And what can I do? Like, challenge that and say, my internal voice might have said before, like, oh, this is impossible. It's never going to happen. And I don't even know where to start. And by flipping that with a question for yourself of just daring yourself to say, well, what if I did that? Or what can I do? That can really help open the door to what may have felt impossible. And it starts to feel possible, even just a little bit at a time. And that's that mindset flip that we have to have if we're going to tackle this amount of debt in our positions as teachers and busy human beings and parents and family members and all of those things. Giving yourself that permission that it is possible and sort of like suspending doubt can be a huge catalyst to starting to make changes.
Yeah, and I love that. And just to add to that, I feel like when you make a crazy, audacious goal for your money, there's no downside. I mean, if you set a wild goal and you're like, I know this is absolutely insane, but I want to pay off 20K of debt in a year or whatever that goal is for you. What's the worst that is going to happen? I feel like the worst that is going to happen is you're still going to pay off a crap load of debt that year. Even if you don't reach that insane goal that doesn't make you a failure, it means you worked your butt off, you shot for the moon and you landed in the stars and you paid off a crap load of debt. So I think that's fantastic.
So let's get into the strategies, or if we're slaying a dragon, we could think of them as weapons that people use to attack their debt. And this is something to think about as flexible. You can change weapons during a fight, and you can change your strategies depending on where you are in the process of paying off your debt. And these are very common kind of public domain ideas for the most part. And you can find a lot of information about them just with a quick search, or pretty much any personal finance book about debt is going to include these options. So one of the first ways to think about paying off debt is called the avalanche method. And it is where you list all of your debts and you're making minimum payments on all of your debts. But when you're listing them from highest interest rate to lowest interest rate. And the debt that you're tackling first is the one with the highest interest rate, because paying high interest is like walking up a down escalator. It is so hard to get anywhere. And this relates especially to credit card debt. And so the idea of that avalanche is you've got that big, huge chunk that you're moving out of the way first, and it's giving way to all of those other debts that are underneath it with smaller interest. And so avalanche is really about focusing on that high interest rate as the part you're tackling first.
Yeah, I love this method, which is silly because it's not even the method I used, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I love the idea of this method because suddenly, as soon as you're done paying off that giant debt with that giant interest rate, or that small debt with the giant interest rate, all of that extra money, plus the minimum payment, plus the interest that you were paying on that debt, can now be focused on that next highest interest rate. And suddenly, that's going to be even easier to tackle than that previous one in all likelihood, because you've got so much more money going into it. And when that one's paid off, then it's just the next one. And it just speeds up as you go along, which I just think is so wonderful. And this method is great for people who tend to be more motivated by the idea of avoiding interest versus maybe making small wins along the journey, because you might not have the same number of small wins with this method. But if you're really motivated by avoiding interest, if you're like, I don't want to give these creditors another freaking penny of my money that I need to, or if you're just like, I want to have all this money that I'm paying in interest, I want to have that in my pocket. If that is super motivating to you, then this is a great method for you. It's also great for people who are confident in their ability to stay the course during their debt-free journey and not give up if you run into obstacles. But if you're like, no, I'm in this, I'm ready to pay this off, it is mathematically the most sensible to pay off the highest interest rate first. And it's also great for people who have a wide range of interests on your various debts. So if you have credit cards and student loans and car payments, like if you've got a lot of different interest rates going on in there, it tends to make more sense to pay attention to the highest interest rate first, because then you're just going to build a lot more momentum towards your goal.
Yeah.
All right. So now let's get into the snowball method. In the snowball method, you list out all your debts. Again, that's always going to be step one, face the dragon, give it a name. And then you're going to, of course, continue to make minimum payments on all of those debts. And then you're going to send all that extra money to the debt with the smallest total balance. So for this one, you actually kind of turn your face to the math of money and you ignore the interest rates. And this is great because it tends to build a lot of momentum, because if you pay off that tiny $200 debt, then you're more motivated when you have to pay off that bigger $1,000 debt. And when that's done, again, all of that money that you were focusing on that debt can go to your next biggest debt. And it really just is a way to get a lot of small wins. Like it's just really nice for momentum reasons.
Yeah. And so it's great to think about it as a snowball, right? It starts small and you pay off that little small bit, and then it rolls into the next biggest debt. And then that rolls into the next biggest debt. I like to think of this method as like the decluttering method, which makes me very happy because you're getting all that little stuff out of the way so that pretty soon you're just down to a few things and you can start tackling those. And you have all that built up experience of paying off debts, and you're more likely to stick with and challenge those biggest ones. So if you think you might get off track in your debt process, your debt payoff process, paying off those little debts can help keep you on track. This is one that gives you those little endorphin hits along the way. And if you need money wins early and often, like if this is a brand new process, the snowball method can be a great way to start because you don't have that delayed gratification. If you have a lot of small debts versus 1 to 2 larger debts, this can be great for you, again, because you're working on decluttering and just tackling them one at a time. And then if your debts all have similar interest rates, then this can be great because you can get all the motivation and benefits without the mathematical loss of not tackling those big interest rates first. So that's a really great way to think about the snowball method.
Yeah, I used the snowball method when I was getting out of debt because all of my debts were student loan debts, and they were all within the same 1 percentage point when it came to interest rates. So it really made sense for me to do the method that would build me momentum and not really lose me that much money in interest. But if I had a lot of debts with different interest rates, the avalanche would probably be the preferred method for me.
Yeah. And then the final method, which we think is proprietary to the awesome David and John, the debt-free guys who also run the Queer Money podcast. This is where we heard of this idea. And it's the debt lasso. And I love this because, hey, you can lasso a dragon. And this is like lassoing a 3-headed dragon, right? So you're going to list all your debts, like step 1 in all of these methods, make all your minimum payments, and then you're going to send all extra money to the highest interest rate debt. So it's similar to the avalanche method, but you're also going to focus your energy on lowering the interest rates on all your other debt through negotiation and finding 0% credit cards or loans to switch your debt over to. So a lot of credit cards, when you move a balance over, will have a 0% balance for a particular period of time. And so that lasso is about roping in all of your debts and rolling balances onto 0% credit cards that you can not have accumulate interest while you're paying off your highest interest rates. So it's a little bit more complicated in terms of you have more balls in the air, but it can be really effective because it can help you tackle that biggest, highest interest rate debt while also kind of pausing interest on a lot of your other debt.
Yeah, this is in a lot of ways like the most sensical way of doing it if you are really good with strategizing. So this is great for people who have a strong understanding of credit and the credit system, and are willing to read and follow the fine print. Because if you're transferring your balance over to a 0% credit card for a year, that's great. But you want to make sure that you can pay that 0% credit off before the end of the year, because with most 0% cards, they shoot up to astronomical interest rates after that period of time. So you really want to make sure you have an understanding of all the fine print. This is also great for people who are highly organized and willing to stick to their plan in order to get out of debt as quickly and cheaply as possible. And this is also great for people who are willing to call creditors and negotiate interest rates, which honestly, I feel like everybody should be doing regardless of what method you're using, because there are so many ways where you can negotiate down your interest that you probably would never even know that you could do, especially if you're, somebody who's made a lot of on-time payments or something like that. You can use that as leverage to say, hey, I'm a valuable customer. All my payments have been on time. Is there anything we can do to lower my interest rate on this card? So all of those things, I think, add to this idea of it's kind of more complicated, right? Because you're calling to negotiate, you're transferring balances, you need to pay attention to the dates, but it's going to save you so much money in the long run.
So thinking about some final tips, remember, you don't have to pick one of these and stick to it forever. You can start with the snowball and get a few of those little debts paid off and then say, oh, wait, now I'm thinking I'm going to start tackling this bigger one because I know more about this process. Or I'm going to lasso these 2 debts onto one while I pay off this other one that is the smallest, because that might make it more manageable to then get back to those bigger 2. So think about it as this is like your toolkit. This is your arsenal. And once you kind of understand those methods, pick the one that works best for you. Another element that really worked for David and I is we made it visual. We had our bank print out statements of our student loans and our mortgage, and those lists were like, okay, so by this date we'll be here. Because a lot of times it was really hard for us to do the math. If we had $110,000 of student loan payments and we made $10,000 extra payments per year, the calculations of interest and balance and all of that was just beyond us. And so they would send us those statements when we asked for them, and we could say, okay, based on this, we're going to pay this off in another 7 years. So don't be afraid to ask for those pieces from your lenders, because it can really help you wrap your brain around how long it will take based on your plan. And then what else, Rachel?
Well, I do want to make a note about making it visual, because so many people have available like debt-free payoff like coloring pages. So like, you add the amounts to the side of it, and then as soon as you have deposited those amounts towards paying off your debt, you can like color in that chunk. I don't know if I'm explaining this well, and I never did this, but I should have, because it looks fun and I love adult coloring.
I love that. No, we never did that. Ours was so boring. I would have loved a coloring page.
Yeah, they have ones for like, also like down payment on a house and stuff. And then it looks like a house, and then you fill in a different part of the house when you have a different amount towards it. So it's pretty cool. I love that kind of thing, because I feel like that, just put it on your fridge, right? And it's right there to keep you motivated. And so you can color in more of the chunks of the page. And then I also just wanted to note that when you start getting focused, I believe that you'll probably be shocked at how much your timeline will speed up over the journey. So this could be because you start feeling motivated to make more money. You might pick up a side hustle because you're like, yeah, I'm getting out of debt in 9 months, but hey, I want to get out of debt in 6 months. So I'm going to pick up a side hustle for a couple of these months to make it happen. Or you'll feel motivated to spend less in certain areas and say, I really don't need that right now. I'm willing to sacrifice that in the short term so that I can speed up this debt repayment. Or a lot of times, there will be times when you come across money you didn't account for. When I got my security deposit back on my apartment, I was like, whoa, debt payment going straight to my debt right here. Like things like that, or maybe tax refunds or any sort of like lump sum of money that you just really were not expecting in any way, which obviously doesn't happen all the time. But when it does, it can speed up your debt payoff date so much, which is awesome. So the more motivated you get and the more focused you get, the more these things are going to start happening, whether because there are just sort of coincidences where you're getting money that you didn't necessarily account for, or because you're getting so much more motivated that you are making it happen even faster.
Yeah, that absolutely happened for David and I. We found that all the time. We were like, whoa, we've got another little bit here. Let's send it off. And we just, once you're focused on it, it's like everything else can align towards that goal. And finally, think about some accountability. Think about if you need a friend or a family member or your partner to help keep you on track and just check in with, whether it can be a phone call to a friend once a month just to check in and say, hey, how'd it go? And, what was your win and what was tricky? Just so that you have some support along the way. This is absolutely not anything that you need to go through alone. And whether it's a more anonymous community, like on a social media platform, or it's someone in your life that you trust and that you feel safe with, that you can share this with, remember that voice is the antidote to shame, and it can absolutely help you continue to move forward if you're starting something that's fairly daunting. So think about getting that debt dragon tamed and on a leash and doing your bidding. You are the boss of it, and you can start to control where it goes.
I love it. Anything else we need to say?
I'm feeling pretty good about things.
I feel good about it too. Thank you guys so much once again for joining us here for this episode. I really hope that this was motivating for a lot of you. And if you have any questions, feedback, or you want to share a money win with us, please send us an email at teacherstalkmoney@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
And next time, tune in to hear an interview with the budget teacher, who is a financial coach and expert on public service loan forgiveness. That's something that a lot of teachers have access to and may be eligible for. But again, the process can be daunting, and he will break it down for us in a way that we can all get started.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining us here on Teachers Talk Money.
Subscribe now to make sure you don't miss a future episode.
Leave us a review of this podcast. It helps more teachers find us.
Share it with a teacher friend who can use some of this information.
You can find more money advice from Christy at Financially Fit Teacher on Instagram and Rachel at Teachers Talk Money on Instagram and YouTube.
All opinions are our own, and our awesome theme music is by John Bartman.